let's begin with Keir Starmer's speech to reset the state. He said it's become flabby and overcautious. You wrote ahead of the speech that there was a feeling in Team Starmer that we have a state that is, quote, both oversized and underpowered. Were you expecting this really quite big announcement, the scrapping of NHS England?
Candidly, yes. Not necessarily NHS England, but I knew there is going to be a butchery of arm's length so-called quangos, regulatory bodies and so on. And that's been clear for a few days now, that they wanted this to be radical and a big, shocking shift of direction. The payment systems regulator is the only other one we know about at this stage, which has gone, but there are plenty more to come. Every Whitehall department has been asked to bring a list of regulators and quangos that they don't believe are absolutely essential to the running of the British state into number 10, and they will be ritually slaughtered.
Well, the NHS England, I believe, was the world's largest quango at top of the bonfire here, or maybe it would be the bottom of the bonfire, wouldn't it? It currently has 13,500 staff. I guess that's office staff, which is 3 times more than the Department of Health. We had there was music earlier in the week that the office staff at NHS England were going to be halved. I think about 6,000, 7,000 jobs going. It's going to be subsumed by the Department of Health. We were talking about this, weren't we, just a couple of weeks ago with our health writer, Dr. Phil Whitaker, who actually thought this was a good thing because it brings a sense of responsibility that we've been lacking in health for, well, more than a decade since NHSE was created.
I'd never like to suggest that we knew the future, but I have to say the New Statesman's ahead of the curve. We were talking about Amanda Pritchard's resignation and speculating as to why in this country we had 2 big organisations, both allegedly running the NHS. And as Wes Streeting has said today, this is the end of those disastrous Andrew Lansley health reforms. This is the final nail in the coffin. I don't think there'll be many tears shed. I mean, we'll see. It gives Wes Streeting himself enormous personal power. So we'll see how that plays out. But it's part of a much bigger picture, I think, from Starmer. And we have, for a very, very long time, probably the New Statesman too, has said there's no such thing as Starmerism. He doesn't really have a vision. He doesn't have politics of his own. I've always thought that was not true. And I think today we see that there is such a thing as Starmerism. It's just a kind of political viewpoint that we are not used to. We are used to politicians with a sort of moral vision of taking us towards utopia, grounded on values which are either religious values or are straightforward traditional post-Marxist socialist values. Now, that kind of vision politics is alien to Keir Starmer. I think what we are seeing instead is a different vision, which is that the state must be much more effective and that the widening gap between voters and politicians and the sense of sort of disillusion and distrust of politics is really because the state does not deliver what it says it's going to do. It doesn't deliver the better education. It doesn't deliver the effective health service, and so on and so on. Therefore, if you want a happier, more successful country, you have to sort the state out. And I think that's what this is all about. Yeah. I think it comes from his experience of international politics, where he said that for years and years we have known that Europe needed to rearm in face of the Russian threat. The Ukraine war has been going on a long time, and nobody has done anything about it. And Europe has moved at the pace of the slowest mover, and that's also the case in the British state. And so he sees a read across from one to the other.
Because he started his speech today actually talking about Ukraine. Exactly.
I think, he has been energised by the challenges on the world stage.
I'm actually really interested with the sort of lack of ideology we've had today. I mean, it was a very muscular speech, I thought. But even sort of the groundwork laid before it, I'm interested in lots of things. I want to hear your views on this, Andrew, because he chose to place the preview, if you like, in the Daily Telegraph, obviously a newspaper on the right, but some couple of standout lines in it for me. So one, he says, I'm not interested in ideological arguments about whether he's talking about the state here, should be bigger or smaller. I simply want it to work. And then we had this really, what I see as quite a big rowing back of the rhetoric towards the civil service. Completely gone was that line from December that we heard from the Prime Minister where he said too many civil servants were comfortable in a tepid bath of managed decline. Very Dominic Cummings-esque. This time, much more conciliatory. He says the problem isn't our fantastic civil servants, it's the system they're stuck in. I just wonder, it feels very, very different. That's deliberate, I take it.
That is deliberate. And it's almost entirely sincere, but not completely. So I would say that you ask most cabinet ministers privately and candidly, and they are disappointed by the support they're getting from the civil service. And they will say again and again, there seem to be huge numbers of people, but whenever I want something to happen or do something or pull a lever, it doesn't happen. And I think Downing Street is going to be gunning for parts of the civil service estate. I mean, vast numbers of press officers and communications staff working in big offices, not really feeding the press what the press needs to get. Very, very hard sometimes to get someone to pick up the phone or get a quick answer on a basic question around the estate. So there are lots and lots of those things I think that are going to change. And I think one way to think about it is if you can imagine a well-behaved, non-mouthy, essentially social democratic and properly dressed Elon Musk, that's what we're going to get.
You say there is now a Starmerism. What is it? How would you convey it?
You say to me, well, so what's Starmerism? What is your vision of the promised land, Keir Starmer? You know, describe for us the land of milk and honey that you're going to take us to. That's what politicians do. And, you know, paint us a picture of this gorgeous, fantastic, different country. He actually says, the Britain that I want us to get to is exactly like the Britain you're living now, but better. It's one in which stuff actually works, where you are safe walking along the street, where you're not constantly worried about the number of people, whatever it might be, coming. And I think that is a completely justifiable, as it were, social democratic worldview. But we are so used to high-flown language and glorious rhetoric that we don't understand the importance of the nuts and bolts. And I think it's really interesting. I've been thinking about this. Now, Keir Starmer's father, as we all know, was a toolmaker. And I think
that passed me by because he never mentions it.
Never mentions it. But I think most people don't know what a toolmaker actually is and does. And probably I didn't until recently. But a toolmaker is actually not an ordinary member of the working class. Toolmakers are very, very skilled, very tough job. And it's about precise measurements and really, really hard engineering work in the physical world, you know, to produce real stuff that actually works. And I think you can see a glint of the toolmaker in this speech. In other words, here's somebody who looks at government as a structure, a machine that needs to be properly calibrated, well-oiled, and actually effectively ground to the right shape. And I think that's his kind of vision. But it's one that we've never really had in the Labour Party at the top before. You know, we've had visionaries, we've had, as it were, secular religious leaders, we've had clerics, all sorts of people like that. But perhaps not since Attlee have we had somebody so interested in the fundamentals and the practicalities.
But maybe that's what we need for a time that is very different to the ones we've had in the past.
You said it, not me.
We guess there may be more quangos going on. The bonfire, you've talked about press office staff. Also, big mention of technology and AI in particular in this speech. 1 in 10 civil servants will work in tech and digital roles within the next 5 years, we hear, and that no person's substantive time should be spent on a task where digital or AI can do it better. Do you have any inkling from the conversations you've had about what level of cuts we can expect to see?
I think over the course of this Parliament, I think they'll be quite big. I'm not going to give you a percentage or a number because I don't know. But I think the proposition that AI can do an awful lot that humans have been doing applies particularly to bureaucracies of any kind, whether they are corporate bureaucracies in the private sector or whether they are state bureaucracies. And because of the way that AI brings together complex quantities of knowledge and then reshapes it, that's really what the civil service spends a lot of its time doing. And so I think there will be very, profound cuts, but think of all those people classed as civil servants who are basically getting individuals back into employment by talking to them, understanding their skill sets. There'll be a lot more. I don't think there'll be much cut in the front-facing, public-facing civil service, but the civil service behind those sort of glorious white walls around Whitehall, those great big stone buildings, I think there'll be far fewer of them.
People are going to compare this, aren't they, to Elon Musk and Doge. Is that a fair comparison? Is the diagnosis the same, but the the drug or the treatment very different?
So Starmer would say it looks a bit similar, but it's fundamentally different.
Okay.
He would say the populist right, wherever you find it, fundamentally doesn't believe in the state. They believe get the state out of the way and everything will be different. He is different. He is a social democrat. He really believes the state is essential to human happiness and to an effective market and the rest of it. But to do that, you have to have an effective state that really gets stuff done and works efficiently. And what we at the moment have is an enormous, blubbery, bloated, rather passive and ineffective state. And he needs to get from that to a smaller but more effective, more active state.
Do you think there'll be support from the Conservatives for this agenda? I mean, I know there's been this shift in tone today and the ideology's been toned down, but some of it is very, very similar to the comments that particularly Dominic Cummings has made for years about the civil service, that you just cannot get anything done.
The Conservatives will say, and in a sense the Conservatives have to say, it's great, but he doesn't mean it, and it's insincere, and it won't work, and he'll never get round to it. In other words, we agree with it in principle, but they won't do it in practice. And they've already pointed out there have been lots of new quangos set up since Labour came to power, most notably Great British Energy. So there are some lines for them there. Nonetheless, when you think that the civil service has gone up by 130,000 since just before the Brexit referendum, all of that increase, of course, or almost all of that increase, took place during the Conservative years.
Just want to talk about the state of the Cabinet and where we're going, because you wrote earlier in the week, it's becoming clear that Team Starmer don't entirely like the government they head. Bit unfortunate, that one. I know we've discussed this before, but things are continually changing. Are you getting a stronger sense that certain members of the Cabinet are really in trouble? Are we going to see a reshuffle soon, do you think?
I think we'll see a reshuffle in July.
Okay.
And I'm not going to predict yet who's going to go and who's going to stay, because this is a kind of ongoing argument. I singled out three people in the piece.
Yeah.
Bridget Phillipson, because I think the centre of government was very, very alarmed about what appeared to be her assault on academy freedoms. Even though she has been to Tony Blair to discuss it and he agreed with a lot of what she was saying, and even though she says she has briefed members of the government, nonetheless, that's a big issue. I think, there is a defensive position she can take, but, that there's clear they don't like that. They don't like the more sort of high-flown climate crisis rhetoric around net zero. They're very cautious of a government of metropolitan liberals lecturing everybody else, though they also do need Ed Miliband's net zero industrial strategy, because they don't have any other industrial strategy. And so that's another one where there is pushback. And finally, Lord Hermer, former friend of the Prime Minister, I think probably a current friend of the Prime Minister. Clearly, they're worried about judicial review and his views about that. He would say that he is not the kind of legalist extremist that he's been painted. It's a much more complicated story. But this comes back to the Prime Minister's speech today, in fact, because one thing that we haven't heard much about is judicial review. I
want to ask you about this. It's had very little discussion, but do you think Labour are going to scrap it?
They can't scrap it because, in essence, if the government...
I know it takes up lots of time, but it's really important.
If the government does something that is oppressive and illegal and affects you need some kind of redress which doesn't involve waiting 4 years for a general election. And judicial review is that redress. So you can't scrap judicial review, but I think you can look at the extent of judicial review and the extent to which judicial review is going deep into what is legitimate policy making by government and demanding WhatsApp messages and emails and paper trails around what are important, necessary, continuing policy discussions. I think that is going to be looked at again. I don't think Starmer's there yet. I think he'll get there. His biographer, Tom Baldwin, said that his approach, and I think this is right, Starmer's approach to any problem, is to look at the problem, look at the obvious solution, go to the obvious solution. If the obvious solution doesn't work, go to the next solution. And bit by bit, he becomes more radical as he's doing that. So I think he will get more and more frustrated by judicial review and look at it harder and harder and harder as this government goes on. But he's not there yet. I mean, he would say that a lot of judicial review is caused by government not being clear about why it's doing what it's doing. And more clarity, more policy clarity from government can avoid the danger of judicial review. But it is the big empty part of this speech, as well, the bit missing part of this speech, perhaps.